Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a quick answer and a long answer, and so my quick answer is the murder thing, which sounds bad if you're watching this video and you don't watch the previous video. And then the long answer is, you're right, it's more like indentured servitude. It's debt slavery, so people...
No, let me make this very clear. There's a distinction between debt slavery and chattel slavery in the Bible. Those are two very different things. A good example of debt slavery or an indentured servant would be the story of Jacob and how he got his 2 wives. You see, Jacob didn't have enough money to buy a wife for himself, as property. And so what he did was he chose to sell his labor, basically, for 7 years to Rachel, his future wife's father. And so he worked for 7 years, but the problem is that the father played a little bit of a switcheroo with him and gave him Rachel's sister, which he then bedded that night and consummated the marriage before he could figure out that this wasn't Rachel. So he worked for another 7 years, selling his labor to Rachel's father in order to buy Rachel, again, as property, from her father. That's an example of the indentured servitude that we're talking about here, at least one that appears in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean that other forms of indentured servitude didn't exist, like somebody was just too poor and didn't have a place to live, or, didn't have enough money to buy food to eat. They could sell themselves into indentured servitude and they would have a home, they would have food and all this other stuff. That definitely did happen. But as far as what's in the Bible and good examples of indentured servitude, the Jacob one highlights a lot of problems with this whole idea of slavery just being indentured servitude, or the idea that indentured servitude was only ever used in the case of not having enough money to have a house and have food. So another curious instance is that with these debt situations, fathers and specifically fathers, could sell their children into debt slavery. That's right. You could sell your child into debt slavery because you owed a debt to somebody. So, there's a lot of different things. It's all covered in Dr. Josh's book. I suggest that you read it. But that would be indentured servitude. Now there's chattel slavery, which chattel slavery is where the Israelites would buy slaves or capture slaves from surrounding people groups. In fact, that Leviticus 25:44 through 46 is specifically God telling the Israelites that is where they can buy their slaves from, and that they are not to get their slaves from the Israelite nation. So, trying to turn the slavery in all of its forms that occurs in the Bible into only ever indentured servitude is not accurate and just shows that you're willing to lie about what the Bible says in order to push your apologetic agenda.
Willingly go into slavery. It's a different kind of slavery than what you and I think of. When we hear slavery, we think of Civil War type slavery in the West. But
well, yes. And do you know what book the lawmakers used in order to model their laws for slavery? The Bible. So the lawmakers who set out the Civil War slavery or the Southern slavery and all that, the laws that govern that are based on the Bible. It's really kind of hard to divorce the idea of chattel slavery from the Bible.
Slavery in Bible times was people would go into debt, and then they would go to the person that they're in debt to and be like, hey, I'll work it off, so that, they work off their debt. And so that's the slavery that they would do.
No. See, that's called indentured servitude or debt slavery. But that's not indicative of all slavery, but that's also not the only situation, like I pointed out before, where Jacob sold his services or became a debt slave or an indentured servant, and in order to buy women as property. So, there's that.
And then after 7 years, that was the max that they could be a slave for. So they would be freed after 7 years. If they went in with their wife and kids, then they'd leave with their wife and kids. But if they married a woman while they were in there, then and that woman had her own debts to pay, she'd have to stay to pay off her own debts.
This is not entirely accurate. A lot of it is accurate, but the woman that he's talking about here with the one debt slave marrying another slave, typically the loophole that exists there is that the master would give the debt slave a wife in the form of an actual slave, like a foreign slave. So a chattel slave. Now, this chattel slave would be, property of the masters forever. Chattel slaves were not released after 7 years. This is just simply a whitewashing of slavery in the Bible. If I had to pick out the purest example of whitewashing of slavery in the Bible, I would send people this video because that's exactly what this is. So the loophole is that the debt slave who gets freed after 7 years, which, mind you, the debt slaves that got freed are only the men. The women most likely wouldn't get freed. But in this particular instance, the debt slave man who's being released has to choose between the family that he's made with the chattel slave or freedom. He can't take the chattel slave with him because the chattel slave is property of his masters. So he's got to make a tough decision. Either he becomes a slave forever or he leaves his family that he's built in that 7 years. But I mean, personally, I feel like that's not really even a choice. I really wouldn't expect the guy to just leave his wife, be like, YOLO, I'm Audi 5000. Like, I just don't expect that out of the guy. Although, I mean, they could do whatever they want. I guess it just would make him a big dick.
So I said a long answer because there's a lot of nuance to it. If your slave does this, the master does this. If the master does this, the slave does this, sort of thing. And so that's the nuance. But yeah, you're entirely right. The biblical slavery is indentured servitude. It's debt slavery.
No, that's not correct. As we've shown, there was definitely chattel slavery. There were definitely slaves that were properties of people. So, yeah.
Nothing like what the West thinks of it when we hear slavery. And then there's some more nuance, like they would adopt foreigners as their slaves occasionally. And in doing so, they had a lot of stipulations if they chose to do so, this goes along more of the murder laws, right? So if they chose to do that, then they had these stipulations. Stipulations included the slaves had to have a day off. They had to be treated as if they're a fellow Jew or an Israelite, whatever you want to call them. They had to be loved like it. They had to join your feasts. They had to do all this fun stuff. They were actually given a compensation so they could go out and they could spend their wage on whatever it was. So
I'm sorry. Did you just say that slaves were paid? They were property. They were not paid for their services. One of the primary aspects of being a slave is that you don't get paid. You are owned by another person. You don't get paid. There's definitely nothing in the Bible about paying slaves. I don't know where you're getting this. A citation would be awesome right now because I have no idea where in the fuck you're getting this from unless it's just from an apologist that's pulled it out of their ass in order to make slavery in the Bible seem not so bad. The Israelite code for slaves, like chattel slaves, actual chattel slaves, was actually a little bit harsher than the surrounding areas. Like, for instance, you could beat a slave with a rod. The Israelites actively believed in the fact that, the only way to instruct a slave is to beat them. That whole spare the rod, spoil the child worked for slaves as well as children. Now, that doesn't mean that they were encouraged to just abuse slaves, but it also doesn't preclude them from abusing the slaves. You kind of have to take it with the nuance that exists there. While it doesn't say, hey, beat your slaves, it also says, hey, don't do that. That's a dick thing. Also, why do you own another person? But yeah, I've never heard of slaves being paid a wage so that they can go out and buy shit in places.
So essentially what it is like what they were doing for those foreigners is they'd give them, so like in college, there's an RA, a resident assistant. And so it's essentially what the college is doing is what they were doing to these foreign slaves, where they say, hey, we'll give you room and board, and in doing so, we'll give you wages for food and stuff like that. That's exactly what colleges do.
No, that is not what chattel slavery was like in the Bible. I don't know where in the fuck you're getting this, but RAs in college are not owned by the college. Yeah, they're given, I guess, money for, providing a service to the college. But, I mean, this is not at all compared to chattel slavery because while the master did have to take care of the slaves, like feed the slaves, shelter the slaves, and everything like that, I mean, you would do the exact same thing for other property, like for other animals that they owned. And that's how they saw slaves, as animals, as property, as chattel, shit to be bought, traded, and bartered. So trying to argue your way around this and coming to this whole idea that it's a lot like being an RA for college, it's just laughable. And I don't know why you would go here with this.